The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as travelers rushed in all directions, dragging their luggage and checking their phones for gate information. Among them walked Dr. William Richardson, a 72-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that had seen both the best and worst of humanity throughout his long career. Today was supposed to be a day of rest. After spending 3 exhausting weeks volunteering at medical clinics in rural communities with limited healthcare access, Dr. Richardson was finally heading home to Los Angeles. His body felt the weight of his age and work. His back ached from standing during long surgeries, and his hands, though still remarkably steady, showed the signs of time that even the most talented surgeon couldn't escape. He wore a simple navy sweater over a button-up shirt, comfortable pants, and well-worn leather shoes. Nothing about his appearance suggested he was one of the country's most brilliant neurosurgeons, a man who had saved countless lives and changed modern medicine with his innovative techniques. His only luggage was a carry-on suitcase and an old leather briefcase that had accompanied him to hospitals and clinics around the world for over 30 years. Gate A23, he mumbled to himself, adjusting his reading glasses as he checked his boarding pass one more time. He'd splurged on a first-class ticket, not because he cared about luxury, but because at his age, the extra comfort made a significant difference on a 5-hour flight. His arthritic knee would thank him later. As he made his way through the terminal, Dr. Richardson thought about his late wife, Rose, who had always handled their travel arrangements before she passed 5 years ago. "You work too hard to be cramped in those tiny seats," she would insist, booking him in first class whenever she could. The memory made him smile despite the pang of loneliness that still hit him at unexpected moments. When boarding was announced, Dr. Richardson joined the line, patiently waiting his turn as the gate agent called for first-class passengers. He stepped forward, handed over his boarding pass, and received a quick, disinterested nod from the agent, who was already looking past him to the next passenger. The jetway was crowded with eager travelers. A young flight attendant greeted passengers at the airplane door with a practiced smile. When Dr. Richardson showed his boarding pass, she pointed him to the left toward the first-class cabin without really looking at him. The first-class section was nearly empty when he arrived. Dr. Richardson found his seat -3A, a window seat with extra legroom, and carefully stored his briefcase in the overhead compartment before settling in. He couldn't help but notice how the flight attendant had warmly welcomed the white businessman in a suit who took the seat across the aisle, offering to hang his jacket and asking if he'd like a pre-flight drink. Dr. Richardson didn't mind. Throughout his life, he'd learned to focus on what mattered, helping others, advancing medical science, teaching the next generation of doctors. The small slights and assumptions people made about him based on his appearance had long ceased to surprise him, though they never ceased to disappoint. He took out his phone to send a quick text to his daughter, letting her know he was about to take off. Then he pulled a medical journal from his briefcase, flipping to an article about a promising new treatment for pediatric brain tumors. Even in his retirement, Dr. Richardson remained committed to staying current with medical advancements. As other passengers filed past to the economy section, the cabin gradually filled. Dr. Richardson sipped the water he'd purchased at the terminal and gazed out the window, unaware that in just a few minutes, his peaceful journey home would turn into something entirely unexpected, an incident that would reveal both the persistent sting of prejudice and the power of quiet dignity. Dr. Richardson had just settled into his first-class seat when he noticed a flight attendant watching him from the front of the cabin. She was tall with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she kept glancing at him while speaking to another crew member. Dr. Richardson pretended not to notice as he adjusted his reading glasses and opened his medical journal, a habit that had helped him through countless uncomfortable situations over the decades. The plane was almost fully boarded now. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay due to air traffic, and passengers groaned collectively. Dr. Richardson turned a page in his journal, focusing on an article about neural pathways, when a shadow fell across his reading light. "Excuse me, sir." The flight attendant stood beside his seat, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Dr. Richardson looked up with a polite smile. "Of course." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded paper, handing it to her without comment. The flight attendant studied it longer than necessary, her eyes moving back and forth between the document and his face. This says 3A, she said, as if he might not be aware. Yes, that's correct. This is 3A, Dr. Richardson replied gently, gesturing to the seat number displayed above the window. She frowned, not returning his boarding pass. Are you sure you didn't misread your ticket? The economy section is toward the back of the aircraft. A few nearby passengers had begun to watch the interaction. The businessman across the aisle, whose credentials hadn't been questioned, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I'm quite sure, Dr. Richardson said, his voice remaining calm despite the familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. I purchased a first-class ticket for this flight. The flight attendant's lips thinned. Let me just double-check this with my colleague. She walked away with his boarding pass still in hand, speaking in low tones to another flight attendant at the front of the cabin. They both looked back at him several times during their conversation. A younger man in a business suit boarded late, hurrying down the aisle to the last empty first-class seat. The same flight attendant immediately approached him with a warm smile, offering to help with his luggage and asking if he'd like something to drink before takeoff. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath and looked out the window. After 50 years of these encounters, he knew better than to show frustration. His late wife Rose had always marveled at his patience. One day they'll know better, she used to say. One day they'll see you for who you really are. A moment later, not one but two flight attendants approached his seat. The original one, now joined by a man with a clipboard who appeared to be the lead flight attendant. Sir, there seems to be some confusion, the man said, his tone condescending as if speaking to a child or someone hard of hearing. This is the first-class cabin. Economy boarding is through the rear door of the aircraft. Dr. Richardson looked at him directly. There's no confusion on my part. I'm in the correct seat -3A, as my boarding pass indicates. The male flight attendant held out his hand. May I see your boarding pass again, please? Your colleague already has it, Dr. Richardson replied, nodding toward the female flight attendant, who reddened slightly. She reluctantly handed the boarding pass to her colleague, who examined it with exaggerated care. The conversations around them had quieted as more passengers became aware of the situation. This does say first class, the male flight attendant admitted, though his tone suggested he found this surprising. Did someone help you book this ticket, sir? Perhaps a family member or the company you work for? The implication was clear. They couldn't believe an elderly black man had booked and paid for a first-class ticket himself. Dr. Richardson felt a familiar hurt, one that decades of accomplishments and recognition had never completely erased. But his face remained composed, betraying none of the emotion beneath the surface. No, he answered simply. I booked it myself. The flight attendants exchanged glances, clearly not sure how to proceed now that their assumptions had been challenged, but not yet ready to acknowledge their mistake. The tension in the first-class cabin grew thicker as more passengers turned to watch what was happening. Dr. Richardson sat perfectly still, his hands folded on his lap, the medical journal now closed beside him. Decades of similar experiences had taught him that showing any sign of anger would only make things worse. Sir, I'm going to need to see some ID as well, said the lead flight attendant, holding Dr. Richardson's boarding pass between two fingers as if it might be counterfeit. May I ask why? Dr. Richardson's voice remained steady. You already have my boarding pass showing I'm in the correct seat. A middle-aged woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing from the flight attendants to Dr. Richardson with a frown forming on her face. It's standard procedure, the flight attendant replied, though everyone within earshot knew it wasn't. No other passenger had been asked for identification after boarding. Dr. Richardson reached for his wallet and handed over his driver's license. The flight attendant studied it carefully, comparing the photo to his face with unnecessary scrutiny. William Richardson, the flight attendant read aloud, as if testing whether the name actually belonged to the man before him. And what brings you to first class today, Mr. Richardson? The question hung in the air, so inappropriate that several passengers looked up from their phones and magazines. The implication was clear. What brings someone like you to a place where you don't belong? The same thing that brings most people to first class, Dr. Richardson answered quietly. I purchased a ticket. The female flight attendant who had first approached him now stepped forward again. Perhaps I could explain how things work up here, she said loudly, as if Dr. Richardson might have trouble hearing. In first class, you're entitled to priority boarding, which you seem to have missed, a wider seat, premium meal service, and... I'm familiar with first class, Dr. Richardson interrupted, his patience finally showing the smallest crack. This isn't my first flight. Well, she continued with a tight smile, sometimes people get confused about their seating assignments. The boarding passes can be tricky to read if you're not used to. I'm not confused, Dr. Richardson said firmly. And I can read my boarding pass quite well, thank you. By now, nearly everyone in the first-class cabin was watching. A few passengers in the front row of economy had also noticed the commotion and were straining to see what was happening. The lead flight attendant handed back Dr. Richardson's ID and boarding pass with visible reluctance. Very well, he said, but I'll need to check the manifest to confirm. He walked to the front of the cabin and picked up a tablet, scrolling through it with exaggerated focus. Dr. Richardson sat motionless, feeling the weight of stares from around the cabin. Some were sympathetic, others curious, a few even seemed amused. All were uncomfortable reminders of how publicly he was being humiliated. A third flight attendant, who hadn't been part of the initial confrontation, approached with the drink cart. She offered beverages to everyone in the first row, then the second. When she reached Dr. Richardson in the third row, she hesitated and looked toward her colleagues at the front of the cabin. It's fine, the lead flight attendant called out. He's on the manifest. The way he emphasized he's made it sound like an anomaly, an exception, a mistake in the system rather than a rightful passenger. Would you like something to drink, sir? The flight attendant with the cart asked, her voice noticeably less warm than it had been with other passengers. Just water, please, Dr. Richardson said. She placed a plastic cup of water on his tray table without meeting his eyes, then quickly moved to the next passenger, with whom she chatted pleasantly about cocktail options. Dr. Richardson took a small sip of water, his throat suddenly dry. Throughout his distinguished career, through medical school when he was one of only 3 black students in his class, through his residency when nurses would sometimes mistake him for janitorial staff, through becoming chief of neurosurgery at one of the nation's top hospitals, he had faced countless moments like this, but they never hurt any less. He glanced out the window, not wanting anyone to see the wounded dignity in his eyes. The incident was far from over, but in that moment, all Dr. Richardson wanted was to become invisible, to disappear into his seat and finish the journey in peace. The uncomfortable silence in the first-class cabin was broken only by the sound of ice clinking in glasses and the occasional rustle of pages turning. Dr. Richardson tried to focus on his medical journal again, but the words blurred before his eyes. He was used to these situations, but that didn't make them any easier to bear. Across the aisle, a woman in her 50s with short grey hair and glasses had been watching the entire scene unfold. She had been frowning more deeply with each passing moment. Now, she closed her laptop with a decisive snap and set it aside. "Excuse me," she called out to the lead flight attendant who was still hovering near the front of the cabin, pretending to organize the beverage cart while keeping an eye on Dr. Richardson. The flight attendant approached with a professional smile. "Yes, ma'am. Can I get you another drink?" "No," the woman said, her voice clear and carrying easily throughout the quiet cabin. "But I do have a question for you." She gestured toward Dr. Richardson. "Do you know who that gentleman is?" The flight attendant's smile faltered. "I'm sorry." "That man," the woman continued, pointing directly at Dr. Richardson now, "the one your staff has been treating so poorly since he boarded. Do you have any idea who he is?" All eyes in the cabin turned toward them. Dr. Richardson looked up, surprised by the intervention. "Ma'am, I assure you we treat all our passengers with—" "That," the woman interrupted, "is Dr. William Richardson." The name hung in the air. The flight attendant blinked, showing no recognition. "I'm Dr. Patricia Chen," the woman continued. "I'm the chief medical officer at Los Angeles Memorial Hospital. And that man your crew has been humiliating is one of the most brilliant neurosurgeons in the world." A soft murmur spread through the cabin. Dr. Richardson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unused to having attention drawn to his accomplishments. Dr. Chen wasn't finished. Dr. Richardson pioneered the suboccipital transtentorial approach for removing tumors that were previously considered inoperable. His technique has saved thousands of lives, including my nephew's. The flight attendant's face had gone pale. I didn't. His research on minimally invasive brain surgery techniques revolutionized the field, Dr. Chen continued, her voice growing more passionate. He's published over 200 papers in medical journals. He's trained surgeons who now work in hospitals across the country. And for the past 30 years, he's volunteered his time performing surgeries in countries where people would otherwise have no access to neurosurgical care. By now, several passengers had pulled out their phones and were searching Dr. Richardson's name online. The businessman who had been seated near Dr. Richardson leaned forward, looking at his phone screen with widening eyes. It says here that he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his humanitarian work, the man announced, looking up at the flight attendants with disbelief. Another passenger chimed in, and he founded the Richardson Neural Institute that provides free surgeries to children with brain tumors. Dr. Chen nodded. He's the author of the textbook that every neurosurgery resident in this country studies. In fact, she added, looking directly at the lead flight attendant, I was just at a medical conference last month where Dr. Richardson was the keynote speaker. People flew in from around the world just to hear him talk for an hour. The cabin had transformed. Passengers who had been purposely avoiding eye contact with Dr. Richardson during the earlier confrontation were now staring at him with newfound respect and curiosity. Some looked embarrassed for having witnessed his mistreatment without speaking up. Dr. Richardson himself sat very still, his hands folded in his lap. He gave Dr. Chen a small, grateful nod, though he had never sought recognition or special treatment. The 3 flight attendants who had participated in questioning him had gathered at the front of the cabin, whispering urgently to each other with horrified expressions. One of them grabbed a tablet and hastily scrolled through it, then showed something to the others. Their faces fell even further. The lead flight attendant slowly approached Dr. Richardson's seat again, his entire demeanor transformed. Gone was the suspicious, condescending attitude. Now he looked nervous, even afraid. Dr. Richardson, he said, his voice cracking slightly. We had no idea. And in that moment, as realization spread throughout the cabin, the true weight of what had occurred became clear to everyone present. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed completely. The same passengers who had pretended not to notice Dr. Richardson's humiliation were now stealing glances at him with newfound respect and curiosity. Some looked embarrassed. Others seemed eager to make up for their silence during his mistreatment. The lead flight attendant stood awkwardly by Dr. Richardson's seat, his face flushed with shame. Dr. Richardson, please accept my deepest apologies for the misunderstanding. If there's anything at all, we can do to make your flight more comfortable. Dr. Richardson looked up at him with tired eyes. Some peace and quiet would be nice, he said softly. Of course, the flight attendant nodded too quickly, backing away. Right away, sir. As he retreated, the other flight attendants huddled together near the galley, speaking in urgent whispers. Their body language told the story. Hunched shoulders, nervous glances, hands gesturing with anxious energy. One of them was on the phone, likely calling a supervisor to report what had happened. The businessman who had been seated near Dr. Richardson and treated so differently upon boarding now leaned across the aisle. Doctor, I just want to say, what happened to you was completely unacceptable. I should have spoken up sooner. Dr. Richardson gave him a small nod, but didn't engage further. He had no interest in absolving the guilt of bystanders. Dr. Chen, who had revealed Dr. Richardson's identity, caught his eye from her seat and gave him a respectful nod. She understood his desire for privacy and didn't approach, but her intervention had changed everything. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were third in line for takeoff. As if suddenly remembering their duties, the flight attendants scrambled to complete the final pre-flight checks, though they now moved through the cabin with an awkward awareness, carefully avoiding eye contact with Dr. Richardson. A young woman from a few rows back got up and timidly approached Dr. Richardson's seat. Excuse me, Dr. Richardson. I'm a second-year medical student at UCLA. I just wanted to say what an honor it is to meet you. Your work on pediatric brainstem gliomas literally inspired me to go into medicine. Dr. Richardson's expression softened slightly. That's very kind of you to say. It's always good to meet the next generation of doctors. Their brief exchange opened the floodgates. Suddenly, Several other passengers found reasons to approach his seat. A nurse who had worked with patients who benefited from his surgical techniques, a man whose sister had been treated at the Richardson Neural Institute, a high school science teacher who used Dr. Richardson's story to inspire his students. The lead flight attendant returned with a bottle of champagne. "Complimentary, of course," he said, setting it down with 2 glasses. "And I've spoken with the captain. He'd be honored to have you visit the cockpit after we reach cruising altitude." Dr. Richardson sighed. This sudden reversal from suspicion and contempt to fawning admiration was almost as uncomfortable as the original mistreatment. The passengers and crew now wanted to make themselves feel better by showering him with attention. News of his identity had spread throughout the plane. Passengers from economy were finding excuses to walk past first class, trying to catch a glimpse of the famous surgeon. Flight attendants who hadn't been involved in the initial incident were now stopping by to introduce themselves and offer extra pillows, blankets, or headphones. Dr. Chen observed all this from her seat and eventually stood up, making her way to Dr. Richardson. "They're overdoing it now, aren't they?" she said quietly. "Just a bit," he replied with a wry smile. "Would you like me to run interference?" "I'd appreciate that." Dr. Chen turned to address the gathering crowd. Dr. Richardson has had a long few weeks providing medical care in underserved communities. I think what he'd most appreciate now is some rest before we land. The other passengers retreated respectfully, though many continued to whisper and glance in his direction. The flight attendants, eager to redeem themselves, became overly attentive, checking on him every few minutes until the plane reached cruising altitude. Sitting back in his seat, Dr. Richardson closed his eyes. The day's events had left him exhausted in a way that even weeks of performing complex surgeries hadn't. The swift change from invisibility to celebrity, from contempt to admiration, was a steadily familiar pattern, one that spoke volumes about how people like him were seen and treated in the world. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Dr. Richardson found himself facing a decision. The airline's customer service representative had called the plane's satellite phone, and the lead flight attendant now stood nervously by his seat, holding out the handset. "It's the regional director of customer relations, sir," the flight attendant explained. "She's been informed of the incident and would like to speak with you personally." Dr. Richardson took the phone, listening quietly as the voice on the other end offered profuse apologies and promises of disciplinary action against the crew members involved. When she finally paused for breath, Dr. Richardson spoke. "Thank you for your concern," he said, "but I don't want anyone fired over this." There was a surprised silence on the other end of the line. This wasn't the response the airline had expected. They had been preparing for public outrage, possibly legal action. "With all due respect, Dr. Richardson, what happened to you was completely unacceptable," the director insisted. "Our company has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior." "I understand," Dr. Richardson replied. "And I agree that what happened was unacceptable. But firing someone doesn't solve the actual problem, does it? It just makes the airline feel better." He handed the phone back to the flight attendant, who looked both confused and relieved. The conversation wasn't over, though. After the meal service was complete and most passengers were watching movies or napping, the 3 flight attendants who had been involved in the incident approached Dr. Richardson's seat together. The youngest of them, a woman who looked to be in her 20s, had clearly been crying. The other 2 appeared tense and uncomfortable. All of them seemed shocked when Dr. Richardson motioned for them to sit in the empty seats nearby. "Dr. Richardson," the lead flight attendant began, "we wanted to personally apologize for how we treated you earlier. There's no excuse for our behavior." Dr. Richardson studied their faces. "May I ask you something? What did you see when I boarded the plane today?" The flight attendants exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I saw..." The younger woman hesitated, then continued with painful honesty. "I saw someone who didn't fit my mental image of a first-class passenger." Dr. Richardson nodded. "That's what I thought. You know, I've been flying first class for over 40 years. I've had my medical license for 47 years. I've published hundreds of research papers, performed thousands of surgeries, and trained hundreds of doctors. And yet, on almost every flight I take, someone questions whether I belong." He wasn't angry as he spoke, just matter of fact. The flight attendants listened in silence, shame evident on their faces. "I've had a long career in medicine," Dr. Richardson continued, "and I found that mistakes are the best teachers, but only if we really examine them. So I'd like you to understand something. When you looked at me, you made assumptions based on my age and my race. You decided I was confused, or that I couldn't afford my ticket, or that I somehow ended up somewhere I didn't belong." The lead flight attendant looked down at his hands. "You're right, we did." "I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse," Dr. Richardson said gently. "I'm telling you because I hope today will change how you see your next passenger. Not just someone who looks like me, but anyone who doesn't fit whatever image you have in your mind of who belongs where." The older female flight attendant wiped away a tear. "We've had diversity training before, but it never really hit home the way this has." "Training is important," Dr. Richardson agreed. "But real change happens person by person, interaction by interaction. That's been true in medicine, and it's true in life too." As they continued talking, Dr. Richardson shared stories from his early days as one of the few black doctors at his hospital. He described patients who refused to believe he was their surgeon, colleagues who undermined him, and the countless small indignities he had faced throughout his distinguished career. The flight attendants listened intently, occasionally asking questions. There was no defensive posturing, no attempt to justify their actions. Instead, there was something Dr. Richardson rarely encountered after such incidents: genuine desire to understand and change. By the time the conversation ended, something unexpected had happened. What had begun as one of the most humiliating experiences of Dr. Richardson's recent years had transformed into something with purpose and meaning, a teaching moment that might actually make a difference. 3 days after Dr. Richardson's flight landed in Los Angeles, a video appeared online. A passenger sitting 2 rows behind Dr. Richardson had recorded most of the incident on their phone. They had captured the questioning, the humiliation, and Dr. Chen's revelation about who Dr. Richardson really was. The passenger had posted it with a simple caption: "Watch how this airline treated a renowned neurosurgeon." Within hours, the video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By the next morning, it had reached millions. Dr. Richardson first learned about the viral video when his daughter called him. "Dad, have you seen what's happening online? You're everywhere." Dr. Richardson, who rarely used social media, was surprised by the public reaction. His phone began ringing constantly with calls from reporters, talk show hosts, and old colleagues who had seen the video. His email inbox filled with messages of support, outrage, and interview requests. The airline issued a public apology within hours of the video going viral. Their statement promised a full investigation and mentioned that they had already reached out to Dr. Richardson privately. What they didn't mention was that Dr. Richardson had declined their offer of unlimited free first-class tickets and had instead suggested they put resources toward better staff training. A week after the incident, Dr. Richardson sat in his home office looking through the hundreds of letters and emails he'd received. Many were from black professionals sharing similar experiences. Others were from young people of color pursuing careers in medicine, law, or business who saw in Dr. Richardson's dignity a model for how to respond to discrimination. One email particularly caught his attention. It was from a high school teacher in Detroit who had shown the video to his predominantly black class of students interested in healthcare careers. "My students were moved by how you handled yourself," the teacher wrote, "but they were even more inspired by what you've accomplished. 3 of them have asked me to help them research neurosurgery programs. You've shown them what's possible." Dr. Richardson smiled as he read this. Throughout his career, he had mentored dozens of young doctors, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. The idea that his humiliating experience might actually inspire a new generation gave it meaning and purpose. Another unexpected effect of the video was the flood of donations to the Richardson Neural Institute, the nonprofit foundation Dr. Richardson had established to provide advanced neurosurgical care to patients who couldn't afford it. In just 2 weeks, they had received enough funding to support their operations for the next 3 years. The airline, facing intense public pressure, had asked Dr. Richardson to consult on their new diversity and inclusion training program. After some consideration, he had agreed. "If my experience can help prevent this from happening to someone else," he told his daughter, "then it was worth it." 1 month after the incident, Dr. Richardson stood before a room of flight attendants and other airline staff. The same crew members who had humiliated him on the flight sat in the front row, no longer in their uniforms but in casual clothes, participating as part of their required training. "I'm not here to shame anyone," Dr. Richardson began. "I'm here because we all have an opportunity to learn from what happened." He spoke for nearly an hour, not just about his experience on the flight, but about the countless similar incidents throughout his life. He talked about the weight of constantly having to prove you belong, the emotional toll of being seen as out of place, and the resilience required to keep moving forward despite it all. The real challenge, he told them, isn't just avoiding discriminatory behavior. It's examining the assumptions we make about people before we know anything about them. When he finished speaking, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Many had tears in their eyes, including the flight attendants who had been involved in the incident. As Dr. Richardson gathered his notes, he reflected on the strange journey of the past month. What had begun as a routine flight home had somehow turned into a national conversation about dignity, respect, and hidden bias. The humiliation he had experienced was still real, still painful. But now it had meaning beyond his personal hurt. Now it had impact. And that, Dr. Richardson thought as he left the training room, was something worth building on.